first day of this conference, but we are particularly happy to have a head start, if you want, because what we want to discuss, we hope, is going to inform also some of the other discussions that will happen throughout these days. So this panel, which intends to be a little provocative, is going to feature 5 presentations, 5 very short presentations. But what we would like to do is to involve you in a discussion. But before that, before giving the floor to our stellar panel, I would like to briefly explain what's the origin of this and what we would like to do. So my name is Stefania Milan, and I work at the University of Amsterdam. And this one sitting next to me is Linnet from Tilburg University, also in the Netherlands. And we are both run a project funded, 2 different projects, so you can imagine, funded by the European Research Council on neighboring issues, if you want. So we're both concerning at taking a critical look at massive data collection and datification from 2 slightly different angles. So what Linnet does with a project entitled Global DATAJUSTICE is trying to connect the issue of data with, as you can imagine, social justice. Whereas myself, with actually Becky sitting there, who is also part of the project, we are involved in a project called DATACTIVE, which takes also a critical look, but tries to connect with the grassroots activism component of ratification, looking at what Becky, for example, is going to briefly touch upon, like security concerns of human rights defenders, amongst many other issues that relate to the interplay between activism, grassroots participation, and ratification. The origin of this panel, well, is quickly said. In a way, we are not lawyers. Actually, none of us in this table here are lawyers, and which is not wrong and not right particularly. But what we have observed, participating in other conferences, Cpdp conferences, that there is some sort of, especially after the GDPR, what Linnet has called a data protection determinism, in a way. So we have suffered a little bit from hearing this conversation about the almost the inevitability of the legislation, like if there's no way out and that's the only thing we have available. And what we would like to do with this panel is actually go a little beyond that and question not necessarily some of the tenets of the regulation as such. As I said, we're not lawyers, but broaden up a little bit the horizon, muddle the waters of the conversation to see whether there's anything we are missing in this conversation, taking the perspective of, as the panel indicate, the panel description indicate, of, among other things, social justice. But I already spoken way too long, so I would like to give the floor to Linnet Taylor. The other speakers, I'm going to introduce them as we go along.
Okay, thanks very much, and thank you, Stefania. So I was interested in doing this panel because I've seen huge gaps in the discussion of data protection over the period that the GDPR has been being discussed. And I'm not alone in this. There are lots of very interesting scholars who are picking away at different parts of the current data protection framework and saying, look, it doesn't really do what we need. It does what it's intended to do very nicely, but it doesn't necessarily do what we need. And so if you come from the perspective of what do we need, you get quite a different idea of what's going on in Europe right now. So I would say, first of all, data protection is fantastic. I'm all in favor of data protection. I'm all in favor of, we'll get to this in a minute, the human rights framework. I'm all in favor of the established frameworks we have. However, they are radically insufficient to deal with the challenges of new data technologies. I'm going to say that we lack the thinking tools to understand what data can do for us, both in a positive sense and in a negative sense. We're not good at perceiving the potential risks because they stretch over generations. We're not good at thinking ahead about problems like this. We're very excited about the potential of new data technologies, and we need better tools for considering what we want them to be and how we can really shape them. So one of the main problems that I see right now is that we're trapped in a liberal individual Western paradigm where we look at ourselves and people like us, and we look at basically a highly educated, technologically enabled elite, and we try to protect them from data we can already see circulating. We think about the blockchain, we think about data that can be captured and identified and kept safe. What we don't think about is people's digital fumes, their traces, which accumulate over time into gigantic autobiographical libraries about every single person. pretty much almost everyone on the planet now is leaving fumes and traces behind them everywhere they go on a continual day-to-day basis, which will be used over generations to determine outcomes for them and for their children and their children's children. This is absolutely clear. And this happens on the group level, on the societal level, it happens on the national level. It doesn't just happen on the individual level. But what data protection frameworks envisage is a single individual rights claimant with more or less perfect information and with access to legal remedies. This is not actually how the world works. We're not all Max Schrems. We're the 25,000 people who were supposed to be in the lawsuit with Max Schrems and who are now not allowed to be. We are people who don't know what's going on with our data, with our digital traces. We are people who are just using technologies because we need them and emitting data about ourselves, and we have no idea where those data are going most of the time. So data protection is pointing in the wrong way, in the wrong direction. It's pointing in the direction of people who know what's going on. That does not characterize the average data subject. The second problem with data protection as it's currently presented is scale. We're not really attempting to tackle the scale in which data is being produced or the scale in which data is being processed and used. Data protection authorities can deal with maybe 2% of the cases that they're aware of potentially risky uses of data. There's no universal auditing system. There is no one educated to audit data in the way that people get educated to audit financial systems. We would never expect financial markets to just operate completely on their own. We audit firms, we audit markets, we have checks and controls and balances. We're not doing this with the data market. We're just letting it go because we can't really see it, we don't really understand it. And we figure it's probably okay for massive corporations to self-regulate. I would argue we don't do this in any other sphere. We don't do this in health, we don't do this in finance. Why are we doing it with data which can affect all of us for a very, very long time? Somehow we've missed that this is comparable to other markets. And last of all, we're really encouraging self-regulation to fill this gap, all of these gaps. We're talking about responsible data analytics. We're talking about consumer trust, as if once these are magically generated with smoke and mirrors, these will solve the problem. If people trust that there's no problem, there won't be a problem. I can think of other industries where this hasn't worked. One example would be the derivatives market pre-2008. People trusted that these incredibly complicated derivatives would be fine in the end because there were highly skilled people trading them and building them, and they knew what they were doing. It turned out that they didn't. And I think we may be going the same direction with the data market. I'm not an alarmist. I don't think we necessarily are. I think that we don't know, and I think that we don't have the tools to know right now, and that is actually what I'm arguing for, is developing some tools and developing a highly trained core of people who are capable of auditing what is going on with the data market. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Linnet. This is what we mean by provocations. So start preparing your own from the floor as well. Next in line is Becky Kazansky from the DATACTIVE team at the University of Amsterdam. Becky, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefania. So this morning I actually want to build on and add to Linnet's point about the limits of our individualistic understanding of privacy, both from a rights perspective and from the perspective of micro-practice. So how do people actually use technologies to achieve the privacy, the data protection that they're looking for? And I think it's important to see that the focus on individual rights has also led to a focus on individual responsibility, and that this has caused the responsibilization of different groups of people. And I think it's really important that we look to future strategies, both in terms of policy and micro-practice, that go beyond this model, which Linnet has already pointed out, of course. So one of the classic examples of the problems of individual responsibility is what we call the notice and choice model, where basically the rights of a person are predicated on the idea of education and on consent to data collection. And of course, over the last few years, there have been many attempts to reform the idea of consent to make sure that consent is freely given. However, the basic premise is still embedded into the workings of our different platforms and services. Checking the box is still something that has to happen, and the box that gets checked holds an enormous symbolic value. And at the same time that this model remains, it becomes less and less possible and much more complicated for people to both understand the environment in which their data is being collected, who is collecting it, and to take steps in response. So this remains a problem, and it extends also down to a very common trope in privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity, which is the idea of user awareness and security awareness. It's called different things, but the basic premise is that individuals must now take on a form of situational awareness in a way to be able to see what is happening around them in every direction, to be able to anticipate what's coming down the line. And this goes beyond basic education to an actual requirement to be constantly crunching data and understanding what might happen next in regards to the privacy and security threats that you have to deal with. And this expectation of situational awareness especially is true for the users who are most at risk. One example of such a group would be civil society actors who work on social justice and human rights. And these are groups that are often targeted not just in the way that everyone else is, but through different kinds of often legal loopholes and exceptions which allow hacking, different kinds of targeted surveillance. And these are groups who have, over the years, worked very hard to develop an education around their privacy, security, data protection. They have learned about terms of service. They have learned about privacy-enhancing technologies. They've learned different digital security tools like email encryption and safe chat tools. But that hasn't made the fundamental problem go away. So the education has happened, but the problem remains. And the question is, what do we then do next? I can provide one case of a women's rights network that I worked with a few years ago on their digital security and privacy needs. And this was a network which worked very hard to build a knowledge of how they are made vulnerable through the terms of service of different platforms, what kinds of governmental surveillance they should worry about. And yet they were repeatedly hacked. They had their social media scraped and used against them in different campaigns. They were tapped, and they were accused of subverting national security interests, actually, because of their fight for women's rights, which we do hold to be an example of human rights defense work. And in response to this problem, in response to realizing that education was not enough, they actually had to develop a collaborative strategy of their own, which was to begin sharing information about threats, to work not just as individuals, but as organizations and later as a network, which would track their threats together, and which allowed them actually to identify who the people were who were tracking them, which parties were responsible, and to begin to plan and understand what they could do in response. And they succeeded in creating a collaborative infrastructure, which allowed them to do this. But on the other hand, it took them away from their human rights work. And instead of being women's rights defenders, they now became, in a way, security actors. And so what we see here is that they managed to overcome some of their issues by taking on this collective strategy and looking beyond the idea of individual education and awareness. And on the other hand, it opened them up to a new set of problems. And just quickly, in a way, the breakdown of the individual model of responsibility has also gone in the opposite direction. So I was just talking about collective strategies and the importance of understanding privacy and security within interactions of groups. On the other hand, civil society actors are now looking to strategies which are more about fragmentation rather than collectivization. And this is because of the difficulty of understanding how the different parties that collect data about us are actually using it to create profiles, to create different kinds of scores. And because profiling and scoring is so difficult to understand, this leads people to have to actually try to break down their digital identity and other kinds and conceptions of identity into different pieces. And they do that through strategies that involve new kinds of software. So, for example, there are a couple of free open source software projects. One is called Tails, one is called Cubes. And these projects are premised on the idea of segmenting user actions and workflows and aspects of identity into discrete boxes which are separated from one another, and which make it more probable that if one part of your identity is compromised, or if one element of your online browsing gets compromised, this doesn't have to affect the other important parts of your life. So this is a strategy that is in motion now. It's basically become a necessity of its own, and I believe that this is important to take into account as we think about data protection at a policy level and in terms of practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Becky, for bringing us closer to the ground. Next in line is Anita Seichan from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Anita, please.
Okay, good morning all. Thanks, Stefania. And I just wanted to build on both Linnet's and Becky's comments. I was asked to provide some commentary thinking about the potential impacts of the GDPR within global context in the global south, and primarily thinking through the experience of Latin America, where I work as an ethnographer on digital rights movements, and thinking in particular about the experience in the early 2000s around the growth of free software legislation in Western Europe, and then the impact that had within countries in Latin America. And so in the early 2000s, if folks might remember, there was a whole growth of different movements, primarily at municipal levels within Western Europe, especially in countries like Germany, where we started to see the growth of different pieces of free software legislation, where the notion was that we might be able to begin to obligate or prioritize the use of free software within public infrastructure, with the notion being that doing so would enable a kind of transparency in government infrastructure, would create more interfaces between civil society organizations, and that would also start to empower a kind of network of different civil rights, civil liberties organizations and nonprofit organizations that were beginning to work around digital rights and a nascent kind of language around data rights, again in the early 2000s. So we saw movements like this starting to grow in Western Europe, not in the US, explicitly not in the US, where I've been, which is my home country, and where I've been employed as a ethnographer for the last 15 years. So we saw no movements in the US explicitly in that way, but most of this, the push was coming from Western Europe. And then within within a fairly short amount of time, so the first pieces of legislation we saw were in the early 2000s. By 2001, we saw legislative movements also growing across Latin America, with Peru, Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela being some of the first countries that were taking up, again, free software bills, either at the municipal level or at the national level. In Peru, we saw the introduction of legislation, Proposition 1609, which was again the first free software bill to obligate the use of open source and free software technologies if they existed as solutions within public offices and infrastructure. A lot of the movements to kind of push for this came from civil society organizations, and by 2003, actually, we ended up seeing parallel bills also being pushed for within educational sectors. So there was a kind of a kind of energy in terms of a replication process, not just in Peru, but again in neighboring countries across South America. So by 2006, some of the bills had actually become passed. But if there's a kind of punchline to the message of my comments, it's that legislative existence does not equal legislative enforcement. So even though by 2006 we had several bills that were passed, not just in Peru, but again in Argentina and in Brazil, in the Peruvian context, we saw very, very little impact in terms of the actual application of the law. So you saw free software applications being unraveled within educational context, but not within broader sorts of public sectors, so that you would actually see a kind of, the sort of hope was that you would actually create more interfaces between public decision-making, public sector decision-making, and civil society organizations. There was no incentivization or no planning to enable a sort of process for more inclusivity. And so without that kind of temporal planning and a kind of deliberate means to be able to include different kinds of organizations as part of the process of decision making, including ones that move beyond just data protection and privacy rights specifically, nowadays as the kinds of decision-making civil society groups that are invited into the conversation without a more kind of planned process for thinking about inclusivity, the strength of application again could be something that's put into question. And I'll end my comments with just a kind of short nod to the kind of organizing that's happened around events like the CPDP, where we see now, of course, different extensions of the conference itself, including obviously the privacy camp as part of the sort of more vibrant cultural space, let's say, to be able to kind of bridge in conversations with different nonprofit organizations. But looking at the means, and in particular some of the conversations that were organized by the European Digital Data Protection Supervisor, and some of the conversations that were organized around thinking through the challenges of the application of the GDPR in conversation with almost 24 different nonprofit organizations and civil society groups. You could see a huge diversity in terms of which groups are being organized or were being included explicitly as part of the conversation. So we saw organizations from the Chaos Computer Club to representation from a whole range of different nonprofit organizations working across Western and Eastern Europe as invitees to the conversation. But you didn't see any nonprofit or civil rights or civil society organizations that were explicitly working on, say, data protection with migrant communities, with refugee communities, with immigrant communities. So there's quite a bit of homogeneity in terms of the kind of demographics of who was represented in the room. And unless we're thinking in a slightly more diverse way around what kinds of organizations are being included, we'll end up with a fairly narrow version of what data vulnerabilities are, what social vulnerabilities are, and therefore also what data protection can look like.
Thank you very much, Anita, for adding a new set of problems to our list. Next in line is Arne Hintz from the Data Justice Lab, basically a sister organization to our other organizations here in this corner of the table. Yeah. I'm not a native English speaker, so I would like to ask the panel to talk a little bit slower. Thank you. That also speaks to our own failure at considering diversity. Thank you for that remark. So, well, Arne Hintz, the floor is yours. You can also introduce the DATAJUSTICE Lab.
Should I use this? Okay. Does that work? All right. So I'm not a native speaker either, and most that will help, I guess. Even though I work in the UK, but I'm not British. So we created recently the space called DATAJUSTICE Lab at Cardiff University, which of course overlaps very much, like thematically, especially with what Linnet is working on, but also with what Stefania is working on, and also as a space to bring some of these discussions together. So I just want to elaborate a little bit more on, or just say a few more words on some of the issues that I think were already maybe to some extent addressed or introduced, particularly maybe in a nutshell, a few thoughts on how I think we need to look at data uses, not just data collection by the state and by public authorities particularly. We need to address the collective dimension of privacy, not just the individual one, and we need to maybe get rid of meaningless approaches towards, or ideas even of transparency and consent, which we also already have heard about, but maybe I'll just say a few more words about that from maybe slightly different directions based on some of the work that we're starting to do at Cardiff at the Data Justice Lab. So basically, if we're looking back at what happened in the past few years, I think we've seen big changes in data collection and in surveillance. This is where we particularly in Cardiff came from, surveillance studies and privacy. When the Snowden leaks happened, the focus was still on the individual users who use the internet, usually to actively communicate mainly. But now our data is collected anywhere we go, no matter whether we're online or not, and no matter whether we actively use the internet or not. So the protection of individual users of the internet is still relevant, but not enough. Also, the focus has shifted from surveillance of communication to the compilation of diverse data sets to profile and categorize us. And Becky already told about profiling, the issue that has become more prominent. And categorizing us not just as consumers, but also as citizens, and to predict and preempt our behavior. Data scores are used increasingly to allocate social services to determine the risk factor of people who have been arrested or who migrate and cross borders, or to assess our performance in the education sector or in job searches and so on. And all this is increasingly determines our opportunities to participate in society and the roles we have as citizens and not just as consumers. And the end game is, I guess, something like the Chinese social credit score, which will serve to assess citizens in all areas of life, or in many areas at least, and allocate services accordingly. But that's the direction of travel, I think, also here in the West. And at our little center, the Data Justice Lab, we're currently starting a research project about that. And so the uses of data by public authorities particularly come to the forefront here. And profiling and categorization also means that the focus shifts from, this goes back to perhaps a little bit to what Linnet started with, from individual privacy to also the collective dimension of data and surveillance. I think that's quite healthy because it points us to the fact that some communities were always more implicated in this than others, even though the Snowden discourse was very much about how we're all affected by mass surveillance. But of course, we know that, for example, Muslim communities and activists were always more implicated in this than white middle-class people, for example. And the more prominent focus on categorization might remind us of that, and that might be quite interesting, actually. So what needs to be done? Again, from a non-lawyer's perspective, just raising a few thoughts. We need to think about regulating, as I said at the beginning, data use, not just by platforms. So that's an emerging and very useful discussion, I think, but also by governments and the public sector. To what extent should, for example, the criminal justice system or the health sector be allowed to use data scores to determine the treatment of people who are arrested or who need health care? Of course, this moves us away from classic understandings of privacy protection, but it's where things are happening at the moment. How can we regulate what happens with the data that is collected about us? How can we regulate the ways in which it affects our lives? Secondly, we need to move away from individual privacy and understand data instead as a collective good that governs societies, not just individuals. Data scores actually demonstrate that we're categorized into different sets of citizens, into good and bad citizens. They also show that our networks and friends, and our personal networks and many other types of connections are increasingly incorporated into data-based governance. So we need to think about how to capture this collective dimension of data. And there are ideas, of course, of doing that. Group privacy has been one of the terms that have been, or concepts that have been introduced. Indigenous communities in North America and in Australia and New Zealand have long thought about data sovereignty as a collective form of control over data rather than individual privacy. So there are starting points, and I think it's useful to think further about those. And thirdly, all this points, and finally, all this points us to the limits of transparency, I think, as a strategy. Maybe that's the most provocative of these things, I'm not sure. It shouldn't be, I think. So far, there's been a strong focus on, as we've already heard, on user consent, on the right to receive explanations of data use, as in the GDPR, and other forms of transparency that assign a key role to the informed user. But consent becomes actually entirely meaningless if we have no idea of knowing what way, in what way mundane and unrelated data types are incorporated into our profiles and scores. And also, as I said before, it's not about the individual user anymore, but it's inevitably a collective project governing society. So we've already, so we've really, I think, reached the end of transparency and consent as a meaningful approach. We need, instead, I think we need far-reaching and yeah, also pretty restrictive regulations of data uses, not just collection, also data collection, but beyond that, with a view on the collective and societal dimension of data. That's that.
Thank you very much, Arne, for adding some extra element, like speaking about the end of transparency and privacy, and the need for think about group privacy and data sovereignty. Now, to conclude, last but not least, we have Valérie Peugeot. You can introduce yourself. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, I have two hats, actually. Well, three. I work for a research department at Orange, the telecom company, and I'm also a member of the French Data Protection Authority, the CNIL, in charge of health data, and I'm also involved in a non-for-profit. But as I was asked to be provocative, I will not speak on behalf of none of those organizations. This is a totally personal view, so please don't tweet it as something coming from the CNIL or whatever. Having said that, I would like to zoom back a little bit and look at the data protection issue from an ecological perspective. Most of the time when we think about personal data, we have a twofold approach. On the one hand, we relate data to fundamental rights such as privacy, freedom, etc. And on the other hand, it is related to innovation, new services, new markets, and the economy at large. And then we're trapped. We're trapped because we are facing those usual conflicting injunctions that, if we summarize it in a very caricatured way, if we want to increase our data protection, we might reduce the capacity to create new services that will boost our economy and create jobs. That's one discourse we hear every day. And if we release the level of protection, we might altogether contribute in building the Orwellian society. So we're locked up in this kind of blind opposition between freedom and economy. But if we zoom back, if we look at the big picture, if, paraphrasing the economic anthropologist Karl Polanyi, we re-enclose the whole data issue, not only in a social approach, but in the ecological transition, which is, I think, the meta transformation we are facing nowadays, then we can start thinking in a different way. When I talk about ecological transition, I'm not only referring to environmental issues, but also to social issues, because they are intimately interwoven. If we do not succeed in refraining the climate change and creating the conditions for a healthy planet, inequalities will explode. So, what's the relationship between data and the ecological transition? You're thinking now, I think. Data collection is energy intensive. For 10 years now, also a little more, we have been fed with the rhetoric that big data means beautiful, that the so-called data deluge is an opportunity for the humanity, and that the more data we collect, the better. In this society of promises, which is pushed by the industry, the consulting firms, the researchers, everybody actually, the environmental factor has never been taken into account. And for instance, we talk a lot nowadays about blockchain, and blockchain is particularly energy intensive as it replicates the information. So what I want to say that if we look at this, if we have this ecological approach, then we have to think in terms of data frugality. Data frugality doesn't mean that we have to drop data collection altogether, of course, But we have to stop collecting data frantically and sort between the data which improves our lives individually or collectively. I'm referring to data for health, data for knowledge, data for research, and those which are superfluous or counterproductive. Once we start monitoring the aims for which the data is collected, we will realize that data collected for personalized advertisement belongs to the second category, as it contributes to reduce the consumer's choices and stimulate an intensive consumption, feeding a vicious circle in terms of ecology. And once we start refraining from collecting those superfluous data, we can, the other way around, nourish a virtuous circle in terms of privacy. So, if we want to move towards that data ecology, if we seek for a model of development that is compatible altogether with a regime of liberty, social justice, environmental sustainability, as well as economic vitality, this implies to explore a twofold political action. On the one hand, first, I think we need a collective work gathering the digital economy actors, the public sector, and the consumer and citizen movements to start inventing tomorrow business models that avoid selling directly or indirectly through advertisement personal data. We cannot consider the limitation or prohibition of targeted advertising without inventing alternative business models. And I'm saying that we need to invite the consumer and citizen movements around the table, because we need them in order to fight actively, and would say fiercely, two misleading ideas. The first misleading idea is the idea that it's linked to the fact that the internet users have been drugged for more than 2 decades now with the illusion of freedom. There is no such thing as free services, although there is no direct monetization. And consumer movements must face this fact. This is not recognized by consumer movements. You know, they still want free services. And the second wrong idea we have to face and to fight against is the proprietary paradigm. Some web evangelists, such as Jaron Lanier, promote the idea that to solve the privacy problem, the easy way is to move from a personalist approach of data to a proprietary approach. I think this is a totally economic-centric view, and closing data into a proprietary regime, moving them to capitalistic markets, does not solve a societal issue. It would be a regression. And the second political action I think we have to move forward is a long-term process in order to build an ecological by design framework for our technologies. In the same way the privacy by design concept has been included in the GDPR, we need, little by little, to push the ecological by design approach into our social norms, and why not into our legal regimes. Because privacy by design and ecology by design are two sides of the same coin. They contribute to the same horizon of a livable society. And that's about my provocation.
Thank you very much, Valérie. We have broadened definitely the scope of the discussion. I tried to summarize it, and certainly, and apologize already, I'm not going to give justice to all of your points, but I think what came out quite clearly is, well, we need to give, we need to imagine a bigger, much more proactive role for what we might call the civil society, the citizenry, organized civil society as well. So civil society organization of various kinds, and civil society, again, for the lack of a better word, should be actually much more diverse. You should pay attention to, for example, reducing the homogeneity of who is invited to the table, also taking into account the diverse consequences that data has on data collection has on community, and the diverse capacities and skills that other people that come to the table. We have to focus on data uses. We have to consider environmental factors. We have to move beyond self-regulation, imagining again an active role for governments and the public sector. And then there is also the big issue of individual versus collective as a dichotomy that so far has privileged very much the first part of the equation, the individual, the expenses of the collective. And there's also the issue of infrastructure that came out of, for example, of what Becky said, and the issue of diversity, how regulation starts here might actually impact or inspire other actions around the world. As I said, this is not conclusive. Let's open now the floor for other provocation and engagement with our speakers. Who wants to break the ice and go first? So what I suggest you to do is, we do have a working mic, although it doesn't seem to have sound attached to it. Okay, no, there's one over there at the end of the room, so thank you very much for your help. I'm gonna gather hands. Please introduce yourself briefly and make sure that you keep your question, if it is a question, brief, and if it is a comment, also relatively brief, to give a room for other people as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Willem de Beukelaar from the Belgium Data Protection Authority. I have a question for Arne, specifically because I think there is another big problem. You face the problem of discrimination of certain groups. If you are looking to the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice in the Telesferingen case in Digital Freedom Island, you see that they are not in favor of any bulk collection of the gathering of electronic communication. They said you have to give more, define it, you have to more define what you are really looking for. And it's only on that aspect that they will try to give the possibility to make mass collection of electronic communication. So a lot of police and intelligence are now struggling with this jurisprudence and saying, okay, if the jurisprudence is in that way, we will discriminate. We will fine-tune the whole area of what we want to assess. And then you come with another very difficult question, and that's discrimination. It's not really because you are walking then in Brussels on Molenbeek, you will try to find all the communications there and not in the rich, fancy areas of this city. So that's a very difficult, it's practically a dilemma.
Well, on the question of data and discrimination, I think we all probably have something to say, and I'm just still thinking about how to kind of respond to that dilemma, other than saying that's a big issue in with regards to data. And there's a lot of work also in academia around the question of discrimination. Now it's one of the main interests in critical data studies. In predictive policing and in the use of data in criminal justice, there are now more and more reports coming out how that leads to, for example, racial discrimination and so on, not necessarily because of like the data system as such, but of course because of the way it is used and the type of data that is collected and so on. And that's one of the big concerns at the moment. How to address this is kind of, I don't know, that would go beyond probably this session, but that's one of the big concerns. Anyone else?
I was just, right after Arne's comments, actually, I also wrote down the kind of notion of data discrimination and actually the realm of scholarship that's growing around the notion of data and discrimination, especially around racial discrimination and around bias in data and around the kind of growth, particularly around predictive policing systems in the hyper-surveillance of certain communities who are extra taxed then because the notion is oh, sorry. So just to slow down a little bit, is right after Arne's comments, I had also written down data discrimination as a kind of category that some scholars have started to work around within critical data studies to think through the notion, again, of not just individual rights, but a version of collective interests around or not so much around transparency, but around social justice. and data collection. And there's been quite a lot of work on the impacts of predictive policing on different communities of color, and also on economically stressed communities. And so I'll just mention very quickly the work of Sophia Noble, which I know many of us are sort of working, or who many of us know as a colleague, Simone Brown also, and actually Kathy O'Neill, who's done some work also around predictive policing and around racial discrimination. But around the other version of discrimination, actually, that has a different kind of component that's a little bit more around class-based and economic justice, is the work of folks like Joseph Turow, who thinks through data discrimination and consumer protections and rights, and thinking about how different economic classes are extra taxed because of their data profiles, which don't privilege them in everything from the generation of coupons to the kinds of different mortgage plans you might be offered, to different kinds of insurance plans you might be offered. So it's not just about racial justice, it's about economic justice as well, in a whole range of different ways that we can be discriminated against based upon our the collective categories in which we're lumped.
Thank you, Anita and Arne. There are 3 questions, so I suggest we take 3 of them. Please be brief, and then we go around the table again.
So my name is Paul-Olivier Dehaye. I'm co-founder of Personal Data.io. So I have a question that it's maybe a remark, but hoping that someone with a legal expertise can bounce on this. And it's based on the comments from the second and third panelist on the right, from the right for me. So you mentioned both the fragmentary nature of identity, the fact that communities might try to protect different parts of their identity through cubes and things like that. And then you mentioned the aspect of group privacy and those issues. So my question is more of a legal one. Isn't there a gap in the GDPR that is not mentioned very often? It's the fact that the GDPR should protect a part of my identity rather than my identity itself, rather than my person. So when I exercise my rights as a data subject, I have to establish my full identity. I have to give my ID. I have to do all those things. It's very cumbersome. But if I could just give a cookie value, for instance, and exercise all my rights around this cookie value, it would be a tremendous accelerator for transparency and for building new tools that would protect, that would evaluate all those systems, etc. It would be much more powerful. But the way the GDPR is interpreted, or will be interpreted, or the way the current regulation is interpreted, is a really cumbersome exercise around rights.
Thank you. We have Nadia here, I guess, next in line.
Well, thank you for a great, stimulating, and indeed provocative panel. So my first remark goes to the last speaker, Valérie. I think it's a great point that indeed environmental considerations can perhaps lead to data frugality, as you put it, or basically enforce data minimization principle. But what if we move towards sustainable, environmentally speaking, data processing techniques? Then what? Would that sort of relax this data frugality principle? And then suppose that it does, and data will become a standard overlay of all aspects of our life and a standard default interface for interaction with the world, government, private sector, what have you. Why, when we speak about social justice and protection of people against harmful effects of data processing, why focus on data? And this is a provocative question that I have. Why data and not what's done by means of using data?
Thank you. I really enjoyed this table. My name is Balázs Bodó. I work for the Institute for Information Law, University of Amsterdam. And the short version of my question would be, is it possible to address all these issues without thinking about a coherent political ideology? And the long version would be that it's probably more or less clear that both the practices and the regulatory frameworks that we are struggling with now are shaped by the Californian ideology or neoliberal political view of how things should be organized, what is the role of the individual, what should be or what should not be the role of the state. And what I've heard so far in terms of the possible solutions, especially Valérie was very useful in that, was that we want everything, right? We want economic sustainability or economic success as well as ecological sustainability. But the usefulness of an ideological framework is that it enforces the fact that you cannot have it all. You cannot have a cake and eat it, and you have to make value choices. And in that sense, probably some of these, the solutions require hard choices between the market, for example, and sustainability, or the state versus individual, the state's roles versus individual responsibility. And to give an example, in the copyright domain, we have two alternative ideologies to the proprietary regime, the pirate anarchies and the communist movements, which is, and I'm wondering if you see any similar frameworks emerging or developing around these issues that you have been talking about in the data protection field, where political ideology shapes action and policy.
Great, thank you, Bodo. There's one more question here, and then, given there's so much on the table, I would like to go back to our speakers.
I'll try to make it as short as possible. My name is Nico van Nieuwenhuizen. I work for the Flemish Parliament, and I have one question for Valérie. I seem to have understood from one part of what you were saying is that targeted advertising is bad for the environment. I don't see why that would be worse than not targeted advertising. Advertising has been around for forever, and the industry is surely going to say that targeted advertising enables you to show only what the consumer wants. So I don't see why that is such a big problem.
Thank you very much to all those who posed questions to the panel. We have 10 minutes to solve it all. So my suggestion is to start from this side of the table and, excluding myself, give the speakers 2 minutes to address whatever they want to the various aspects that have been raised. Linnet.
There were many questions were addressed to me, so I might start. Sorry. I am very difficult to answer, to react to all those very interesting points in such a short time. I agree with you, and I wanted to pick up after what Linnet said before. We should not focus so much on data, but at the same time on algorithm. And this is something which is moving in the right direction at the moment. There are in different countries. In France, we have had a first very interesting experience because last year we passed a law, the law for a digital republic, which obliges the public authorities to explain the algorithm they are using, how the algorithm they are using for decisions which have consequences on people work. And that was the first suing, I mean, and the CNIL took a decision to stop the use of an algorithm which was made for students to choose the university they want to attend. And so the education department, the minister, had to stop the algorithm and rebuild a new algorithm. So that was a very good example of a mix of personal data, very personal data about students, and an algorithm, and how you can regulate those algorithms. I don't have time to explain more about this, but I think, and the issue of algorithm regulation is picking up in Brussels at the moment, at the level of the Commission, and we have to push into that direction very strongly. There was a second question, your question, but I can't remember at the moment. So I will answer the others and maybe we come back. You're right. We need a general policy framework. And of course, this was a little bit included in what I said. And I don't think we're facing a chicken and egg situation. I think it's not naive saying that we can build a different society having at the same time a very brilliant, active economy and social justice, etc., as I mentioned before. There's no contradiction there. But we we have been so much fed with the idea that this has to be a choice that we have incorporated it in our social norms. So we have to move away from that vision of society, basically. That's what I tried to do very modestly this morning. And about advertisements, there's a difference. I think the targeted advertisement in general is, of course, feeding more consumption and is in contradiction with an ecological vision, ecological transition. But the targeted advertisement is enclosing us in, it's a bit difficult for me to say that in English. It's enclosing us in what it is supposed to be or taste. So it's a much more influence, it's a much stronger influence for the industry of influence, basically, because it makes us belong, that it's not advertisement anymore, but it's a service. That's the way they sell it. They say it's a service, and it's not an advertisement anymore. We're helping the consumer to consume in a better way. But at the end of the day, it's not a better consumption, it's just more consumption. So in that way, it's the step, it's more effective in a way, and it's more counterproductive. I don't know if it's clear. I'm sorry, my English is very poor there.
Thank you very much, Valérie. Becky now, so we go the opposite direction.
Yeah, I'm just going to address the one comment question that came up about what can be done legally in response to the perceived need to be able to control which parts of your identity are required to do different things online. So I'm not a lawyer, so I can't provide an answer on that, except to say that the examples I gave where people are following these strategies of fragmentation, segmentation, trying to keep certain things separate from others as a safety measure, as a measure to try to have anonymity, these are very important, but they're not sufficient. And the makers of these different kinds of software that can help users with this acknowledge that there's only so far that such strategies can go. They might be more helpful, for example, with targeted surveillance in some ways than with the problems that come of aggregation and scores, which occur for everyone online, not just the people most at risk who I've talked about from civil society. And so really this would require a more policy level acknowledgement of the issue and really pushing back against the continuous drive for stronger forms of identification. Just to take the Facebook example of the real name policy, because that's become so notorious, this has been, people have tried to push back against this from the data protection perspective. And to a certain degree, they managed to prove the point that, for example, real name identification on Facebook can be harmful, especially to the civil society group who I brought up, which was the women's rights defenders. But it wasn't enough, it wasn't sufficient, and so there does need to be a more of a policy level drive to allow people to control different parts of their identity. Yeah.
Thank you, Arne.
Yeah, just on a couple of points that basically I liked, and that's why I just want to say a couple of more words about it. So why focus on data as such and not on what's done through data? That's kind of exactly what we're thinking, what many of us here I think are thinking about, but also what at Cardiff University, what made us kind of create this data justice lab and think more about issues around social justice and data. Exactly to look at how data implicates and interacts with wider social justice concerns. So some of what we did there was to actually look exactly at environmental movements, at other civil society concerns and activism, and how is data part of that, and how also does data implicate what is happening there, and to thereby then come to a broader perspective on data as a form of governance and its implications for transformations in how society is governed, and I think that's kind of the most interesting part of it. Now, in terms of, and that goes in a similar direction, politics, political ideology and background, I think that is kind of exactly where we see the dividing lines also in the debate and in the different interests that are at play in these various debates. Linnet started to talk about the informed and empowered user, and how to also criticize that, the focus on self-regulation, that is very much kind of one particular political angle of and background of the privacy and data regulation debate. I think that can be criticized also from a political perspective. Data ethics has become the big trend issue and a very fashionable debate, incorporating data ethics as part of in ideas of corporate social responsibility and so on. But what it doesn't do, I think, or I think we think at the lab in Cardiff, is it doesn't really address the underlying political economic structures that are very much based in data collection and generate the focus on data and data analysis and so on. And yeah, from these political economic perspectives, there's a lot to be done and to be thought about. What are the underlying trends and what are the underlying concerns?
Just quite quickly, to build on maybe two comments that were made for questions that were posed in the audience. On the question of alternative models of governance that are maybe informed by different kinds of political models, I think about the Barcelona en Común case and the work with different ayuntamientos, so neighborhood-based organizations around that basically exercise a kind of model for thinking about social justice and around data collection and around thinking about community-based education around what kinds of data profiles are being collected, not at the level of individual, but the level of neighborhood. So what happens in terms of the ayuntamientos and the data education campaigns that are being run are that instead you have data being shared with communities and with neighborhoods that demonstrate to neighborhoods how they've been profiled already by the existing data pools around them. It's just a slightly different model. So again, that's the Barcelona en Común case, that instead of thinking about the data subject as this individual California libertarian neoliberal subject that's able to perfectly exercise their rights around data ecologies that would look up and basically scrape, you know, some kind of, or figure out, try and gain some kind of algorithmic audit, which are not the majority of citizens, work through a different kind of model as the citizen subject in relationship to data profiling. And the other question that I wanted to quickly just touch on was this notion of, does data collection always benefit? Doesn't it always benefit in some way, or primarily benefit bias towards benefiting a consumer agency? And I would say absolutely not. And you can think about, for instance, the means by which, let's say, health insurance companies are trying to encourage more data profiling and are creating incentives, for instance, that individual health insurance customers should include more trackers in terms of their for their health profile, so that we have a little tracker for each time we go into the gym that can record how much time we spent in the gym, how many days we've gone to the gym, and of course the idea is that that will lower premiums for, of course, the ideal data subject, that every time they go to the gym, spend 45 minutes, go 5 days a week, has the time, not only obviously for a gym membership, but also to spend an hour a day in the gym, and then that will supposedly lower your premiums. That, of course, hides the fact that the same health insurance companies are actually adding taxes, or actually raising premiums for those individuals that don't do that kind of exercise of being able to either say, I'm going to put on the tracker, or that has a time and the expendable economic, buffer to be able to afford the gym membership, and again, go every hour or every day for an hour, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a hidden tax, in other words, in much of the kind of consumer profiling that disproportionately impacts the economically marginalized.
Thank you very much. And Linnet, please.
Okay, I'll try to wrap up. Thank you for great ideas, everybody. I'd like to go back to a lot of the questions seem to focus on what Valérie said. I'm interested in the idea that people have an intuitive sense that there is a disjuncture between data protection and the world that we live in. And that there's a general feeling, and it's reflected very much in the program of this week's conference, I think. I really applaud Cpdp for taking the step, that we need to address that disjuncture because we're being told to make do with inadequate legal provisions and to think small and not to ask the difficult questions. All of us who apply for grants, we're being told not to ask the difficult questions a lot of the time. You can't question the law. The GDPR took a lot of effort to get in place. It's a good thing. It's going to address many of the issues, so we should go with it and we should push it as far as it can go. I think we all have a responsibility as scholars, as citizens, as activists, not to agree with that, actually. I think that the gap currently is expected to be addressed by ethics, and I would encourage you to ask yourself whether anywhere in history important gaps in the law with regard to rights have been successfully addressed by extremely powerful actors choosing to act ethically. I'm not sure this is a realistic expectation, and yet we seem to be pinning an awful lot of hope on tech corporations not using data in every way it can be used. So I would encourage us all to go into this week's conference with difficult questions in mind and to be relentless and to say them loud and clear, because they need to be asked. We need to push at the boundaries of the law right now and say the law is not sufficient. It's very good, but it's not sufficient for all of the reasons that have been brought up today. We need something broader. We need a political solution to this. And we need political will, which can be generated at places such as this. So I'll pass to Stefania to say thank you very much, but thank you to the panelists.
Thank you very much, Linnet, for connecting all of this, looking to what happens here next day, in the coming days, and looking forward. So without further ado, I think we are already a couple of minutes into the coffee break. As we already mentioned, we would like this to be the start of a conversation and of some critical thinking. So feel free to approach any of the speakers as we move out of the room and in the coming days as well, and also our respective groups in the future. Thank you very much, everyone.